Hi, everybody. In part one, I talked about differentiating content, what students learn, and process, the activities they go through as they learn it. Now, I want to talk about differentiating product. I mentioned Carol Tomlinson or Carol Ann Tomlinson at the end of my last video as one of the key researchers in the field of differentiation. And her books really focus on product, and she would argue that a differentiated classroom is really a product-based classroom where students engage in really long-lasting multi-week units for products. I don't know that that's always possible or feasible in modern classrooms, but I still think there's some things we can get from focusing on product and trying to give students some choices in how they're assessed at least sometimes. So again, from Tomlinson's approach, when we talk about product, we aren't only talking about assessment at the end of a lesson, for example. Rather, this is a long-term endeavor that's designed to help students rethink, to use, and to extend what they've been learning over a significant period of time. That might be over the course of a multi-week unit, but even over the course of a quarter or a semester or even the entire year. And a good product will represent students' extensive understandings and applications of the material. And it's also part of the curriculum that students can most directly own. They have the most ownership of. The purpose of a good differentiated product is to cause students to think about, apply, and expand on their key understandings and skills over the span of learning, whether it be for a unit, a semester, or a year, or some other time period. Now, the format is sometimes dictated by the curriculum. Sometimes students have to write an essay. That's all there is to it. Sometimes they have to design an experiment. Sometimes they have to participate in the science fair. If you eventually teach middle school, for example, I would encourage you to participate in National History Day, which begins at the middle school level and is very beneficial for students. Products are designed to get students to apply their ideas and skills that they've been learning. It can help students explore ways of expression that they're not familiar with. And it can be built on areas students are interested in. And one of the examples that Tomlinson gave in one of her works, I don't remember which book it was, I read this many years ago, but it's one of the coolest things I've ever heard of. And it was a class that was studying westward expansion in social studies. And westward expansion is typically covered in fifth grade, but part of me thinks it wasn't fifth grade. That was actually a somewhat younger grade, like third grade or fourth grade. And that's possible too because social studies standards are at the state level even today. There are national standards sort of set by the National Council for the Social Studies, but they aren't as implemented as much around the country as some others are, I think. But regardless, there was a student and he was super interested. He was passionate about musicals. And as they were studying westward expansion, he wrote and directed a class-wide westward expansion musical. That to read the description of it was it was a remarkable achievement for any student, much less a student in elementary school. And I would argue that is probably a once in a career or maybe a once a decade type of thing. Like, I don't know if that teacher that Tomlinson was talking about had students like that, if that was a typical thing every year or not. Maybe it was, but it's still, I think, worthwhile to explore. Now, in a product, you as the educator are going to determine things like your core expectations, perhaps a rubric for evaluation, how students should work on their products, including what's going to be in class and out of class, and what the nature of the final product is going to look like. Now, students can expand on this. They can go beyond. They can give their input. And you as a teacher should, of course, know and communicate with students what a quality final product is going to look like. Scaffolding is important here to help students at different levels. So you want to help figure out how you can assist your students in reaching new levels of possibility. And products here are designed to stretch students. You need a balance between structure to focus students and to guide them, but also the freedom needed to support innovation in thought. And once all of that is done, differentiation of the assignment can actually begin. So this comes from Tomlinson's work. I know it's probably hard for you to see. I will have the PowerPoint uploaded to the course site so you can look at it there. And as I mentioned last time, We do have access to many of Tomlinson's books as ebooks in the library, so you have access to those from wherever you are. Just log in with your Star ID and search for Tomlinson, books in Tomlinson. You will find various ebooks. This page is a series of possible products. So I'm just going to mention a few of them. Write a book, design a game, write letters, conduct interviews. That could be real interviews, but it could also be fictional interviews, like interview fictional or interview historical people, like real historical people, but who obviously aren't around. Multimedia projects, plan a journey, design a political cartoon, do a demonstration, present a news report, present a mock trial, write songs, create a dictionary about the topic, design a simulation, again, a musical is mentioned here as well, develop tools, write poems, conduct a debate. And you might look at this and think this is clearly not appropriate for elementary school, but in fact, many of these things are things that in developmentally appropriate ways, kids in elementary school can in fact do. It will look different, right? A third grader's debate is going to look different than a sixth grader's debate, but they can still debate. A second grader's poems will look different than a fourth grader's poems, but they can still write poems. So very often, remember, students are going to rise to the expectations that we have for them. Now, those expectations should be grounded in, as I mentioned last class, the zone of proximal development of Vygotsky, but it's important to have high expectations for all of our students. What about for your students who have IEPs, for your learners with exceptionalities? Well, one thing to make sure of, sorry, I have to check on time because I have an appointment coming up. One thing to make sure of is that the product and the class remains appropriately challenging, that the product is built around the main ideas of the class or the main ideas of the unit. If possible, you should integrate goals from the learner's IEP. And although it's appropriate, depending on your class, to require written language as part of the product, it's also important for you to allow students ways to express themselves in ways other than only written language. And you are going to have to maybe, likely, give more structure, break steps apart, give things to students one step at a time. You might choose to record directions, such as on a video or just even as an audio recording. Create timelines for the work when each step is due. Provide mini lessons as needed for needed skills. Help students find resources. Provide organizers templates to help, like graphic organizers. And occasionally, and this is probably good for all students as well, review the big picture. Why is this important? What are you learning? How does this relate to class? And so on. As learners, if learners are working in groups, join those groups obviously as needed to advise them and keep them on track. As you create rubrics, make sure you emphasize the most important areas. Provide examples once you have them from past years and examine them together. Provide adult support as needed. And provide language support as needed. What about for your learners who are advanced learners, whether they have a gifted label or not? Here, our products are designed to stretch them. That might be in terms of complexity, of independence, of abstract thought, or something else. You might look at key issues or questions that cross time periods or disciplines or cultures. So maybe you're teaching sixth grade Minnesota studies and you realize that you have students who already know this information. And you might choose, well, I wonder how this relates to what is going on in Japan in the 1880s in Minnesota versus the 1880s in Japan. Or I wonder how early Minnesota history compares and contrasts with early, pick another state history. You might choose in a geography unit in fourth grade to, while most learners are focusing on, say, just the Midwest for that unit, you might have learners who you want to compare the Midwest to the Pacific Northwest. You should include advanced materials that are at a more challenging reading level, include primary sources, and so on, other resources, in other words, and when possible, use mentors who can really provide feedback at an advanced level on the quality of the work. You might even consider letting advanced learners start earlier on a project if the complexity warrants it and compact their other classwork. We talked about curriculum compaction in video 1 of this series. And again, when practical, it's great if you can have products given feedback by outside experts. Again, that's one reason why participating in things like National History Day is really beneficial for all students, but it's especially beneficial for advanced learners because it really gives them a chance to push themselves in ways that the standard curriculum, unfortunately, usually doesn't. I do want to mention some notes about children who are gifted, whether or not they have that specific label. To quote Susan Weinbrenner, who wrote a great book called something like Working with the Gifted in the Regular Classroom, and I think you can also find that as an ebook in the library if you search for Weinbrenner. I'm not 100% sure if it's an ebook or not, though. It's a great book. I strongly recommend it. Everyone should have in their classroom libraries for you as a professional resource. It's been around forever, so you can find used copies of earlier editions for cheap. But one thing that Weinbrenner said in one of the first editions of her work is that gifted kids learn fast and forever. In other words, they need a lot less practice than their peers. They need a lot less review than their peers. Gifted kids, unlike everyone else, don't benefit from mixed ability cooperative learning. Gifted kids should not be given more work. It should not be, oh, you're done with your assignment. Here, now do this worksheet. All that does is teach them to work slow, because if you work fast, you just get more work to do. Give gifted kids different work rather than more work. And then never, ever, ever have gifted students serve as peer tutors. Do not do that in any subject. Many of you have probably had the experience of an instructor or teacher who has really known their content well, but has not been able to explain it to you or to your classmates. That is what you're making gifted kids do if you put them in a peer tutor role. If they are truly gifted in that area, like in social studies here, let's say, they are so far above their classmates academically that they struggle to explain it in a way that their classmates will understand. And remember, they are not trained teachers. Do not put gifted kids in peer tutor roles with non-gifted kids. Peer tutoring can be great for lots of kids in lots of situations, just like cooperative learning can be, but it's not something you should do with kids who are gifted, working with kids who are not also gifted or also potentially academically gifted. And then I want to end with the learning styles myth. So you almost certainly have heard of learning styles as verbal or auditory, visual, and kinesthetic. There is no research supporting learning styles. Learning styles have been called the most persistent myth in education. The sort of learning style inventories that are out there are not valid, they are not reliable, they have not been tested. And beyond that, the research that's been done that said, well, let's pretend they exist for the sake of argument. Does it help students if teachers differentiate by learning style? No, it doesn't. Why is this myth so pervasive? Well, we know that people do differ in how they learn. Someone who is 6'3" may find it easier to learn to play basketball, but that doesn't mean they're a kinesthetic learner. We do know that students learn better when they can make connections to their prior learning or to their interests, and we should give them opportunities to do that. Learners also have preferences in how they learn, like alone or in a group, listening to music or not. But those preferences do not determine how well they learn. For example, we know that studying while listening to music, especially music with lyrics, does not help students. It hurts students' studying abilities. We know that people cannot multitask. People say they can, but when we test it, if you're trying to do 3 things at once, each of those things you do a little bit worse than you would do if you're doing one thing at a time. Mixed media, which is also really popular recently. Give lots of different modes of communication. That research is actually mixed, and it tends to be based on student engagement. Sometimes something that is different is engaging to students. It doesn't relate to learning style. We know from cognitive science that memories are usually stored in our minds in terms of meaning, not completely disregarding the modality of learning, if we learn it kinesthetically or visually or auditorily. And we also know that different memory representations can't substitute for each other. So visual representations only are poor for storing meaning, and auditory representations remembers the audio but not the meaning. There probably is a difference in how acute, how strong someone's visual memory or auditory memory is, but it doesn't typically make a classroom difference. The cases where it might are things like, someone who has a strong visual memory might do well in cartography, or even in geography if you're analyzing maps that day or in that unit. Someone who has a strong auditory memory probably does better in foreign language and maybe in music, where that's important. And then there's the multiple intelligences of Gardner, which you've also, I'm sure, heard of before. We have linguistic, logical, mathematical, spatial, bodily, kinesthetic, musical, interpersonal, intrapersonal, naturalist, and existential. And at times, I think Gardner has said there are many more that haven't been really uncovered yet. Interestingly, Gardner himself has called learning style incoherent. Now, learning different content requires different intelligences. You cannot teach using preferred intelligences. If you are teaching math, teaching it in musical intelligence is not helping them learn how to add fractions. It might help them memorize a mnemonic device, but it's not helping them necessarily with the concepts of math. The intelligences connect strongly to certain content areas. Here's a quote from an article by Westby that I'm going to put up on D2L. Insistence on learning styles may be unhelpful at best and ill-conceived at worst. It is a waste of your time as a teacher. Your time is better served in other practices. Now, I mentioned Carol Tomlinson. Some of her early works do talk about learning styles as part of learning preferences. She has actually walked away from that in more recent works because learning styles are increasingly recognized as myths. Unfortunately, that has not gotten to all schools of education yet, and so you're still going to be introduced to learning styles in classes. It sometimes even shows up on licensure exams in states that require licensure exams. They don't exist. They are myths. I do not want to see them in your lesson plans. So to wrap up from last time and this time, there are 3 areas we can differentiate: content, process, product. There are 3 ways we can differentiate: by readiness, by student interest, and by student learning profile. The purpose of differentiation is to help students learn to their potential, teach to the learner, not to an imaginary middle of your classroom. And finally, learning styles are myths. It may be beneficial to use multiple intelligences appropriately, including by helping students build strengths in multiple intelligence areas that they are not already strong in. So I hope you found this beneficial and useful and thought-provoking. If you have any questions, please send me an email, and thank you for watching.